We think we know what happened during the War in Heaven. The Old Ones, masters of the galaxy, architects of reality itself, got themselves into a fight they couldn't win. The Necrontyr and their star gods pushed them to extinction. End of story, right? Ancient history. Nothing but bones and ruins left behind. Except there's a problem with that narrative, a big one, and it's currently eating its way through the galaxy from the eastern fringe. The Tyranids shouldn't exist, not the way they do, not with the sophistication they demonstrate, not arriving exactly when they did, from exactly where they came from. Every single aspect of the Great Devourer raises questions that nobody in the Imperium wants to answer, because the answers are too disturbing to contemplate. But some of us have been asking those questions anyway, digging through fragmentary records that predate human civilization, cross-referencing Necron testimony with Eldar mythology, analyzing the Tyranids themselves, looking for fingerprints that shouldn't be there. What if the Old Ones didn't lose the War in Heaven? What if they just changed the parameters of victory? What if the Tyranids aren't an invasion at all, but something far more deliberate and far more ancient? Let's start with what doesn't add up about the official story. The Imperium teaches that the Tyranids are extragalactic predators drawn by the psychic beacon of the Astronomicon. Simple, neat, completely wrong. First issue, the Tyranids came from beyond the galactic rim, from the intergalactic void. That isn't just empty space, it's the most hostile environment imaginable for biological life. No stars, no warmth, barely any matter at all. The distance between galaxies is measured in millions of light years of absolute nothing. Any biological organism trying to cross that gap would need to survive conditions that make the depths of space look hospitable. They'd need to maintain genetic integrity across time frames that make geological epochs look brief. They'd need energy sources we can't even theorize about. The Imperium's answer? They went into hibernation, they drifted. They're just that tough. That explanation falls apart the moment you examine Tyranid biology in any detail. These aren't simply organisms built for endurance. They're the most sophisticated biological constructs ever observed. Every Tyranid creature from the smallest ripper to the largest biotitan represents genetic engineering so advanced it borders on the impossible. The Magos biologists of the Adeptus Mechanicus have spent centuries trying to understand even basic Tyranid adaptation mechanisms, and they're no closer to replicating it than they were when Hive Fleet Behemoth first arrived. Think about what Tyranids actually do. They don't just evolve, they adapt within a single generation. They consume genetic material from prey species and incorporate useful traits into new organisms within hours. That's not natural selection. That's not mutation and survival of the fittest. That's directed genetic engineering operating at a speed that requires intelligence, planning, and technology that makes the Imperium's gene forges look like children's toys. Who taught the Tyranids to do that? Because that level of genetic mastery doesn't emerge from random chance, no matter how many millions of years you give it. Someone built that capability into them. Someone who understood life at a fundamental level that current science can't match. Someone like the Old Ones. The Old Ones had a signature. We can see it in every species they touched. The Eldar didn't evolve naturally. They were uplifted, engineered, crafted from lesser beings into psychic powerhouses. The Krork, what we now call the Orcs, were deliberately designed as biological weapons, complete with genetic memory and technological instincts hard-coded into their spores. Even the Jakero, those seemingly harmless simian tinkerers, show signs of genetic programming beyond anything natural evolution would produce. Every Old One creation shares certain characteristics: psychic sensitivity, rapid adaptation, purpose-built biology. Genetic resilience that allows them to thrive in conditions that would destroy naturally evolved species. And most importantly, a kind of directed purpose woven into their very DNA, as if the species itself knows what it's supposed to do. Now look at the Tyranids and tell me you don't see the same fingerprints. The hive mind isn't like other psychic phenomena in the galaxy. It doesn't draw power from the warp the way human psychers or Eldar farseers do. It doesn't commune with chaos or make bargains with demons. Instead, it creates something else entirely. A psychic network so vast and so powerful that it actually suppresses the warp itself. Wherever Tyranids go in force, the Immaterium grows quiet, calm, almost peaceful. The Imperium calls this the shadow in the warp and treats it like another threat. They don't seem to understand what it actually represents. The warp has been broken since the war in heaven, torn apart by the psychic death screams of countless civilizations, poisoned by the birth of Slaanesh, corrupted by chaos itself. And the Tyranids bring silence to it. They bring order. They suppress the very thing that's been killing the galaxy for millions of years. Who else but the Old Ones would understand the warp well enough to design a biological entity that could calm it? Who else would have the motivation to create something that could heal the damage done during the war in heaven? But there's more. Look at how Tyranids consume biomass. They're not just eating, they're cataloging. Every planet they devour gets broken down to the genetic level. DNA sequences get extracted, analyzed, and stored. Useful traits get preserved. The rest gets recycled into raw biological material. The Tyranids aren't destroying life, they're archiving it. They're building the most comprehensive genetic library in the galaxy's history, one planet at a time. That's not the behavior of a mindless swarm. That's the behavior of a creation following very specific programming. Programming that prioritizes genetic diversity and biological information over simple consumption. Programming that suggests whoever made them wanted to preserve something for later use. The war in heaven lasted for millions of years. Entire star systems got vaporized. The Catan devoured suns by the thousands. The Necrons turned whole sectors into graveyards. And through it all, the Old Ones fought back, creating new species and new weapons, desperately trying to turn the tide. But they were losing. Slowly, inevitably, they were being ground down. The Necrons were too numerous, the Catan were too powerful, and the warp itself was beginning to fracture under the weight of so much death, birthing the first whispers of what would eventually become the Chaos Gods. The Old Ones weren't stupid. They must have seen the writing on the wall. So what would a species that advanced do when faced with inevitable defeat? The same thing any intelligent civilization would do. They'd plan for survival. They'd create contingencies. They'd ensure that even if this iteration of their civilization fell, something of their knowledge and power would endure. Not all the Old Ones stayed to fight the final battles. Why would they? The greatest minds, the most powerful psychers, the ones who understood that this war had already been lost, they would have left. Not to another part of the galaxy because the war was everywhere. Not to the Webway because that would eventually be found. No, they would have gone beyond the galaxy itself, to the one place their enemies couldn't follow. The intergalactic void. Think about what that would mean. The Old Ones had mastered the Webway. They could create stable passages through the warp to any location in the galaxy. Extending that technology to reach beyond the galaxy. Difficult maybe, but not impossible for beings of their power. And once there, in the cold dark between galaxies where even the warp grows thin, they would be safe. Untouchable, able to watch and wait and plan. And in that isolation, with all the time in the universe, what would they build? Imagine the remnants of the Old Ones, floating in arc ships beyond the galactic rim. They've saved what they could, genetic samples from a million species, knowledge accumulated over eons, the collective wisdom of the galaxy's first civilization. But they know they can't go back, not yet. The galaxy they left behind is poisoned. The warp is broken. Their enemies, even in victory, have doomed themselves to an existence of eternal death. So they wait, and they plan, and eventually they begin to build. The project would take millions of years. It would require all of the remaining knowledge of genetics, of psychic engineering, of biological manipulation. They would need to create something that could survive in the intergalactic void, something that could remain dormant for epochs, something that could awaken and fulfill its purpose when the time was right. They would create the ultimate expression of everything they'd learned, not a weapon to fight enemies. Those enemies were long dead or sleeping. Not a species to terraform worlds. Those worlds were already teeming with failed civilizations. No, they would create something far more ambitious. They would create a reset button for the entire galaxy. The Tyranids in this context start to make a terrible kind of sense. They're not optimized for war in the traditional sense. They're optimized for harvest, for consumption, for the systematic breakdown and preservation of genetic information. Every adaptation they make, every new bioform they create, it all serves the same basic function, extract biological data, and store it efficiently. The Hive fleets aren't separate entities competing with each other. They're more like fingers of the same hand, each one probing a different part of the galaxy, gathering different genetic samples. When they meet, they don't fight. They share information. When one Hive fleet learns something, eventually all of them know it, because they're all part of the same larger organism, the same grand design. And that design has a purpose: strip the galaxy clean, consume every scrap of biological information, store it all in the vast living genetic library swimming through the void, suppress the warp through sheer psychic weight, calming the immaterium and draining the power from chaos itself, turn the galaxy into a clean slate, and then the old ones return. The first confirmed Tyranid contact happened in M41. Before that, nothing. Oh, there are scattered reports if you dig deep enough. Strange encounters at the galaxy's edge, unexplained disappearances of frontier worlds, vague warnings from ancient Eldar texts, but no major incursions, no hive fleets. The Tyranids waited. What were they waiting for? The fall of the Eldar happened in M30. The birth of Slaanesh tore a hole in reality and created the Eye of Terror. The warp, already damaged, reached a new level of corruption. The Great Crusade followed, with the Emperor attempting to unite humanity before the galaxy tore itself apart. Then the Horus Heresy, more chaos, more corruption, more death feeding the Immaterium's darker aspects. By M41, the galaxy had reached a critical threshold. Chaos controlled huge swaths of space. The Imperium was drowning in its own ignorance and superstition. The Eldar were broken and dying. The Orcs were everywhere, mindlessly fighting anything that moved. The Necrons were beginning to wake up, adding yet another threat to an already doomed galaxy. The galaxy was as corrupt as it was ever going to get. Recovery seemed impossible. The younger races had proven they couldn't be trusted with the old one's legacy. The time was right. And that's when the Tyranids arrived in force. Not random or coincidence, right on schedule for a plan set in motion 60 million years ago. If this theory is correct, there should be evidence. Someone should remember, and conveniently we have an entire species that fought in the war in heaven still around to ask. The Necrons should be the galaxy's ultimate authority on the old ones. They fought them for millions of years, they studied them, they killed them. If anyone knows what the old ones were really capable of, it's the Necrons. So what do the Necrons think about the Tyranids? They're terrified. Not concerned, not interested in studying them as a curiosity, actively, genuinely terrified in a way they aren't of any other threat in the galaxy. The Silent King himself, Szarekh, broke his self-imposed exile specifically to warn the galaxy about the Tyranid threat. A being who orchestrated the biotransference of his entire species, who shattered the Catan into shards, who has seen empires rise and fall for 60 million years. He came back early because of the Tyranids. Why? The official story is that Tyranids eat all biological matter, and the Necrons want to reverse biotransference someday. They need living bodies to exist, so naturally they're worried about a force that consumes all life. But that doesn't explain the level of fear. The Necrons have contingency plans for everything. They have weapons that can destroy stars, technology that manipulates time itself, super weapons locked in vaults that make the Imperium's cyclonic torpedoes look like firecrackers. If they just needed to protect some biological samples for future use, they could do that easily. No, Szarekh is afraid because he recognizes what the Tyranids represent. He's seen this before, in the days of the War in Heaven. He might have intercepted Old One communications about a final project, emergency protocols, contingency plans, the kind of thing you'd dismiss as desperate fantasy from a losing enemy, until 60 million years later when it arrives exactly as described. Trazyn the Infinite is another interesting case. He's a collector, an archaeologist, someone obsessed with preserving history. He should love the Tyranids as a subject of study, the ultimate example of biological engineering, a mystery wrapped in an enigma. But instead he treats them with extreme caution. His museum tomb contains samples of almost every species in the galaxy, but his Tyranid specimens are locked away in the most secure vaults, with safeguards that suggest he's terrified they might escape and do what? Follow their programming? Complete their mission? The Necrons remember the old ones too well. They know what that ancient civilization was capable of. And now they're watching those same capabilities manifest in a new form, right on schedule for a plan they thought they'd foiled when they won the war. So what happens next? If this theory is right, what's the end game? The Tyranids keep coming. More Hive fleets appear from the intergalactic void, each one larger than the last, each one incorporating lessons learned from previous encounters. They adapt to every defense the galaxy throws at them. They learn to counter the Necron's technology. They develop immunity to Imperial weapons. They evolve strategies to fight chaos itself, which should be impossible but somehow isn't. And slowly, inevitably, they consume everything. Humanity falls, the Imperium drowns in endless waves of bioforms that just keep adapting and improving. The Space Marines make glorious last stands that buy time but change nothing. The Imperial Guard dies in numbers too large to count. Holy Terra itself eventually falls, the Emperor's palace consumed by creatures that evolved specifically to breach its defenses. The Eldar go extinct, again. Their craft worlds got cracked open and harvested. Their souls got consumed by Slaanesh while their bodies feed the swarm. The genetic legacy of the Old One's most beautiful creation gets added to the archive. The Orcs enjoy the fight while it lasts, then they too get overwhelmed. Somewhere Gork and Mork laugh at the best scrap they've ever seen, right up until the last Orc falls and the Tyranids reclaim the Quark genetic template for storage. Even Chaos struggles. The Tyranid shadow in the warp grows stronger with each world consumed. The warp itself begins to calm as the psychic pressure of countless souls gets replaced by the cold, directed intelligence of the hive mind. Demons find it harder to manifest. Chaos gods find their power waning as their food source. The emotions and souls of living beings get systematically eliminated. The Necrons, they fight the longest. Their technology lets them hold out where others fall, but eventually even they're forced to retreat, back to their tomb worlds, back to sleep, waiting for the harvest to finish so they can wake up to, what? An empty galaxy or something worse? Because after the harvest comes the rebirth. Imagine the galaxy after the Tyranids finish, every world stripped to bedrock, every ocean drained, every forest consumed, every city turned to dust. Nothing left alive, just empty planets orbiting empty stars, cleaned of every trace of the civilizations that tried and failed to survive. The warp, starved of souls and emotion, collapses back to something resembling its original state. The Chaos Gods weaken, perhaps fade entirely, their power broken by the sudden absence of the living souls they fed upon. The Eye of Terror might even close, the wound in reality healing once nothing remains to keep it open. And then the Old Ones return. They come back to the galaxy that's exactly as they left it, empty, clean, ready for cultivation. But now they have something they didn't have before. A complete genetic archive of every species that evolved in their absence. Every adaptation, every mutation, every successful survival trait developed by the younger races over 60 million years. All of it cataloged, preserved, and ready to use. They begin again, but better this time. They've learned from their mistakes. The Eldar were too physically sensitive, too prone to excess. This time, that gets adjusted. The Krork were too aggressive, too hard to control. The new version gets more sophisticated safeguards. Humanity's capacity for faith and belief could be harnessed more directly. The Necrons proved that biotransference was possible. Maybe that knowledge becomes useful. The Old Ones rebuild their garden. New species get seeded across the empty worlds. New civilizations get carefully cultivated. New safeguards prevent the catastrophes that led to the war in heaven. The warp gets managed properly this time, kept stable, prevented from birthing chaos entities. The galaxy enters a new golden age under the guidance of its original masters. And the Tyranids, they return to the intergalactic void, back to sleep, back to waiting, patient gardeners ready for the next time the galaxy needs pruning. Every new encounter with the Tyranids adds weight to this theory. The Octarius War showed us that Tyranids don't just fight, they experiment. They pushed the Orcs to evolve, to develop new fighting styles, to adapt in ways that made them more dangerous. And then the Tyranids consumed those improved Orcs and added the genetic data to their archive. It's not war, it's stress testing. quality control for the genetic database. The Cryptman Gambit tried to starve the Tyranids by destroying habitable worlds in their path. It didn't work. The Tyranids just adapted, learning to extract resources more efficiently from barren worlds, developing new feeding mechanisms. They treated it like a puzzle to solve rather than an obstacle to overcome, almost like they'd encountered resource denial strategies before, like they'd been programmed with countermeasures for exactly that scenario 60 million years ago. Hive Fleet Kronos emerged specifically to fight chaos. Think about that. A Tyranid fleet evolved specifically to hunt demons and close warp rifts. The Imperium assumes this is just the hive mind adapting to a new food source, but it's more than that. Kronos doesn't just kill demons, it seals warp breaches. It suppresses chaos manifestations. It actively works to heal the damage chaos does to reality. Who benefits from a galaxy with less chaos corruption? Not the Imperium, they're locked in an existential war with the Tyranids. Not the Chaos Gods, obviously, but beings who wanted to return to a stable galaxy, one where the warp hasn't torn holes in reality. They'd benefit immensely. Even the way Tyranids prioritize targets makes sense in this context. They don't just attack the nearest worlds or the most populous. They seek out genetic diversity. Feral worlds with unique biospheres get hit just as hard as hive worlds with trillions of people. Death worlds with exotic life get harvested with the same care as paradise planets. The Tyranids want samples of everything, every variant, every adaptation that evolution produced during their long absence. If all of this is true, if the Tyranids really are the Old One's final creation, following programming laid down before humanity even existed, what does that mean for the galaxy's desperate defenders? It means the war is already lost. Not might lose, not could lose, already lost. The Tyranids aren't an invasion that can be repelled. They're not a threat that can be eliminated. They're inevitable, part of a plan so vast and so patient that the entire history of human civilization is just a brief moment in its execution. What of the Imperium's desperate stands? Buying time, nothing more. The Space Marines' glorious victories? Irrelevant in the long term. Even if humanity managed to destroy 105 fleets, 1,000, there will always be more. Because the Tyranids aren't coming from a home planet that can be found and destroyed. They're coming from the intergalactic void, from processing centers and biofactories built by the Old Ones in the cold dark between galaxies. And they have time. All the time in the universe, because from their perspective, from the Old One's perspective, this is just cleanup work. The galaxy failed. The experiment didn't work out. Time to sterilize everything and start over. The only hope would be finding the Old Ones themselves. Somewhere beyond the galaxy they're watching, waiting, sleeping perhaps, dreaming of the garden they'll plant when the harvest is complete. If they could be found, if they could be reached, maybe they could be convinced to call off their creation. Maybe they could be reasoned with, but that assumes that they're still capable of reason. That assumes 60 million years of isolation hasn't changed them into something incomprehensible. That assumes they'd care about the pleas of species they designed as temporary tools, now begging not to be recycled. The Imperium has dozens of names for the Tyranids: the Great Devourer, the Eversor, the Doom of Life. Each one emphasizes their destructive nature, their hunger, their threat to all living things. The Eldar call them different names in their flowing tongue, each one heavy with sorrow and resignation. They've seen this pattern before in their ancient texts, in warnings passed down from the days when the species was young, and the Old Ones still walked among them. But there's another name, an older name, found in fragments of text predating the War in Heaven, in data cores sealed in the deepest Necron tombs, in psychic echoes the Eldar refuse to translate. A name that doesn't emphasize threat or hunger or doom. A name that translates roughly to something far simpler and far more terrifying. The Great Gardener. Gardeners plant, gardeners cultivate, gardeners tend their growing things with care and attention. But gardeners also prune, they pull weeds, they clear out diseased growth. They prepare the soil for the next planting season. And when the gardeners return to a garden that's been left untended for too long, when the weeds have choked out everything beautiful and the soil has turned sour with neglect, they don't try to save what's there. They burn it all down and start fresh. The final truth is the galaxy isn't being invaded. It's being harvested. The difference matters more than words can express. An invasion can be repelled. An invasion has supply lines to cut, leadership to eliminate, morale to break. An invasion ends when the invaders decide the cost is too high or the goal is no longer worth pursuing. A harvest ends when everything has been gathered, when every useful crop has been collected, when the fields are empty and ready for the next planting. The Tyranids aren't trying to conquer the galaxy, they're trying to save it in their own incomprehensible way. Save it from chaos, from the mistakes of the younger races, from the corruption that poisoned the warp and turned reality itself into a battleground between sanity and madness. They're following ancient programming, executing a plan their creator set in motion before the stars were young. They don't hate, they don't fear, they don't even really hunger, not in the way we understand hunger. They simply do what they were made to do with the patient inevitability of a force of nature. Somewhere beyond the galaxy, in the cold dark between the stars, the old ones wait, sleeping perhaps, dreaming of the garden they'll plant in this clean soil of a purified galaxy, waiting for their most perfect creation to finish its work, waiting to come home. And when they do, when the last planet has been stripped and the last gene sequence has been archived, when the warp is calm and the galaxy is quiet, they'll rebuild. They'll create a new garden from the seeds of the old one. They'll make everything perfect this time. The galaxy will bloom again, beautiful and terrible and utterly alien to everyone that came before. And somewhere in that new galaxy, encoded in the DNA of whatever species the old ones create from the archived genes of humanity and Eldar and Orc and every other race that ever lived, somewhere in there will be a memory, a fragment of what we were, a ghost of civilizations that tried and failed and were harvested for their useful traits. We won't be gone, not really. We'll be part of the garden, recycled, reused, remade into something the old ones deem worthy of their perfect vision. Whether that's better or worse than extinction is a question the Tyranids don't care to answer. They just keep coming, keep consuming, keep harvesting, following their programming with the cold precision of a scalpel cutting away diseased tissue. The Great Gardener tends its plot, and soon, on a cosmic timescale, if not a human one, the harvest will be complete, and the old ones will return to their garden, just as they always planned.